We live. We live. Didn't get to see Alex's draft picks in the decision making. Shout out to Jack Warner. Shout out to everybody in the brand new Dynasty startup. Right before we went live, I picked Trey Lance and DeAndre Swift at the 1-2 turn in a Dynasty PPR Superflex startup. I'm feeling great. Thought about going double mobile QB risky options with Hurts and Lance at the 1-2 turn. Went against that, went with the logic, went with the smart approach, went ahead and grabbed that young cornerstone running back that I can build around. But part of me died inside, did not see how that team would have turned out if I had gone Lance, Hurts to start the draft. But Alex, we need to dive into some wide receiver prospects. This is a deep class. I'd say not as deep as the running back class compared to recent years, but it is nonetheless a deep class. The top end talent is there. And for some of you guys that are drafting in your dynasty leagues, especially even super flex drafts, like Treylon Burks is going as the 101 in some of these rookie drafts. So Alex, we're going to break them all down here. What do we got? 15 guys on the docket for today. We'll run down the list. If you guys are rocking with us, hit us up in the chat. And of course, hit that Discord channel. Join a dynasty startup with us. You think your takes are better than ours? Then put your money where your mouth is. Join a dynasty startup in that Discord channel. But Alex, you ready to jump into this thing?
Yeah, we got 12 guys we're going into in depth here. A couple extra names we'll throw out there as well. And this is just our initial list of some of the top prospects. We got the combine coming up this weekend, so we're certainly going to get into more and more names. We'll see these guys move up, move down, and really know who the big players are going to be. So I know we're coming to you live. We're trying this new thing out where we go through our typical takes, our typical videos on a live stream. So it's not going to be your typical Q&A format where we're really going to be hitting on every single question from the chat, but keep that chat live as we're talking through prospects. If we're talking about Treylon Burks, for example, and you have questions, you have comments that are relevant to that player, throw them in there. And as we finish out the takes, we'll try to hit on those and get to some of those questions as well. But Stef, I'm glad you shouted out the new DMS Dynasty League that we started. Again, if you want to play with us, join that Discord in the link below. And be sure to hang out with us and just ask your questions as well. But Stef, let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to take it from the top here and start out with the receiver that I'd say is most people's number one in this class. I do see some hot takes here and there. The combine is going to teach us a lot, and we'll see how these mock drafts continue to shake out. But first, to Treylon Burks out of Arkansas. And this dude's an absolute beast. I mean, how exciting is this guy? I know, Steph, you're excited for your Cleveland Browns, hoping they take him in round one. But this is essentially the closest thing we have to like that alpha wide receiver, do-it-all receiver, physically and talent-wise in this draft. He's 6'3", 232 pounds. So Treylon's an absolute unit if you haven't seen him play. He is about to turn 22, but he's an early declare. We love to see that. From wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, doesn't matter. If you look at his season at Arkansas, he had 66 receptions, 1,104 yards, and 11 touchdowns. So it's a good season, but it's not like the video game numbers you see from some of these other guys. But what's important to remember with Treylon is that Arkansas threw for 213 yards a game. So this was like a gross running offense. Their quarterback was a running quarterback, and they didn't throw the ball much, and it all went through Treylon Burks. 46% college dominator rating, 31% target share at Arkansas. So he really is that ultimate receiver in this class. He has the DK Metcalf size that you look for. He likely is going to run a little bit slower than DK Metcalf did. I mean, DK is training for the Olympics now, but he's still expected to be in that low 4.4 range in his 40-yard dash. So that's fantastic for a 6'3", 232 pound wide receiver. And he's big, fast, explosive. He can win those 50-50 balls. He's a red zone threat. He really doesn't have a lot of weaknesses to his game. So I do expect the draft capital to check out. I expect the combine numbers to check out. And I think Treylon's going to be the first wide receiver off the board, could be the first player off the board, even in a lot of these super flex leagues. So if he goes in that top 10 to 15 picks in the NFL draft, I think it's wheels up for Burks, and he could be one of those generational talents at the wide receiver position. Actually, I don't want to say generational because that seems to get people all fired up because we seem to have him every single year. Justin Jefferson was generational. Jamar Chase was then generational the next year. So I don't want to overuse that word, but he should be one of these next top dynasty wide receivers that could be a top 5 guy as early as his rookie or sophomore year.
The one blemish that you could find on the Treylon Burks profile is his breakout age, but his breakout age at 20 and a half years old, still 50th percentile. So middle of the pack, but that was his freshman season. At a 19-year-old player with a 16% target share on an anemic Arkansas offense, actually had 130 special teams yards as a freshman as well. That's something you like to see to be, prove that a guy's an explosive athlete. Is the team getting the ball in his hands outside of just their traditional role? Are they taking jet sweeps? Are they doing things on special teams? Burks was doing that his freshman season. And I don't want to overreact to breakout age. For me, it's more of the threshold. You want to see guys in the top 50th percentile. 50th percentile or better, right? Above average, because of the 41 seasons played since 2008 by wide receivers selected in the first or second round with a below average breakout age, only 4 have finished top 24 in fantasy football at the wide receiver position. Calvin Ridley is one of those names. Had a below average breakout age coming out, and he's a guy who has given us a wide receiver for output on the season. And when it comes to these wide receivers, the combine metrics, they matter, but they don't matter as much. They matter more for the type of player, right? If you have an undersized player, they need to show something exceptional at that combine, right? If they don't look like a Treylon Burks, who's a 6'3", 230-pound athletic freak, they need to look like a Wan'Dale Moore. Wan'Dale Moore was a super athletic, undersized, a guy that I don't think we've seen a player. What is he, 5'7"? I don't think we've seen a player at his size. He was really hard to come up with a comp coming out last year. So it matters, right? The combine metrics, but not as much as running backs. And draft capital matters a lot. It's the number one highest correlating factor to fantasy production for these wide receivers, but it still doesn't matter as much as running backs. And for me, the focus this year is how are these players, profiles going to allow them to fit into an NFL offense and be successful. Right? Treylon Burks to Cleveland, while I would love that as a Browns fan, terrible for his fantasy outlook and his fantasy output, because we've seen Baker Mayfield struggle to get it to the outside. So there's things that could happen that'll change the way these guys get drafted. And everyone says, just ignore landing spot. It's all about skill. That's all that matters. And to a degree, I agree, but that landing spot is going to be so important for these receivers, because receivers are reliant upon the quarterback and reliant upon the offense, right? How often is that offense passing for them to be successful? Granted, you don't want to over-index on that, where we had, A.J. Brown was a guy, I remember when he first came out, Alex, you and I were tentative to go all in on the A.J. Brown hype train, because we thought Brown first offense, Corey Davis is still there, Tannehill's throwing the ball less than 30 times a game. We don't want to necessarily go all in on A.J. Brown, but eventually, as time went on, he emerged to be that monster. So it matters. All these things matter, but there's a lot of nuances to the wide receiver position. But talking to a guy who is a nuanced receiver, a smooth receiver, an athletic separator, it's Garrett Wilson out of the Ohio State University. This is one of those players that just has that nasty release off the line of scrimmage, combined with the deep speed to be a true deep threat at the next level. He's good at all levels of the field, and he was used all over the field in college. He played on the outside as a freshman, a modest 40 receptions, 432 yards, 5 touchdowns that year. And that was Justin Fields' freshman year. So coming into a stacked wide receiver room, we had Chris Olave breaking out. We even saw Jameson Williams, who we'll talk about later here, a prospect I'm very high on. He was also buried in that Ohio State wide receiver room, only 6 receptions that season. So it was not surprising to see Garrett Wilson kind of struggle to have that monster year as a freshman because of how loaded that Ohio State roster was. But in 2020, Garrett Wilson had that monster breakout year, 59th percentile breakout age right when he turned 20. Took 73 of his snaps that season from the slot. So he started on the outside, moved to the slot, put up more yards from scrimmage than Olave. He's a whole year younger at that time when he broke out. And it was a weird, 8-game season in 2020 with COVID. Still put up 43 receptions for 723 yards and 6 touchdowns. That's a 13-game pace of over 1,100 yards. It was 1,174 yards and 10 touchdowns. That was his pace. And 28% target share as a true sophomore, truly exceptional. That 21-20 season for Garrett Wilson was fantastic. And then 2021, true junior year, CJ Stroud comes in after his redshirt freshman year. They move Garrett Wilson back to the outside. And while you have Jackson Smith and Jigba breaking out over 1,600 yards, 22.5% target share, you have Chris Olave putting up another 900 yards, 13 touchdowns. None of that mattered because Garrett Wilson is nasty, and he's going to get his no matter what offense he's in, no matter who's around him. He was right there with Jackson Smith and Jigba at 21% target share, so literally 1% lower, and then outproduced Chris Olave with 122 more yards and 12 touchdowns in 11 games. He was on pace for 1,250 yards. He had more yards per game than his dominant sophomore year. That has the early declare. He's projected round 1 draft capital, might be first off the board. It could be Treylon Burks. And that's one of those things this year. We don't have those chalk options when it comes to the draft. The draft capital this year is really, really tough to project, which is why people are going wide receiver early if they're drafting now, because you don't know if a guy's going to go top 15 or is he going to fall to middle of the 3rd round. It's really, really tough to project. But what Garrett Wilson has showed is that he can play all over the field. He's not super physical. He's not a Treylon Burks who has this A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf type profile where he's trucking guys, shedding tackles like it's no big deal. He is not a yak monster. And I think that's the only hole in the Garrett Wilson profile that I can tell. But he is more of that player like a Stephon Diggs, right? 6 foot, 195 pounds. Garrett Wilson, 6 foot, 193 pounds. So athletically, physically, very similar. You could even compare him to like Deontay Johnson. He's a little bit smaller, 5'10", 183. Justin Jefferson, 6'1", 202. So these are guys that are these athletic separators. They're not necessarily going to be the biggest yak monsters, but they can make these receptions deep downfield. Garrett Wilson, to me, is the most pro-ready receiver in this class. Very polished. He's the technician of the class. You could see him playing a Keenan Allen role for a team, being a target magnet wide receiver 1. Or he could be a strong number 2 like Diggs was in Minnesota because he's so versatile. His formula for winning routes is shown to be effective in the modern era. Defenders cannot stay with Garrett Wilson. It's a guy I'm very high on this year. But Alex, I can't stop gushing about Garrett Wilson. You're going to have to stop me.
Yeah, man. I love what Garrett Wilson did because you have a stacked receiver room there at Ohio State, and he really emerged as one of the most reliable guys. I mean, I know Jackson Smith and Jigba was fantastic. I'm excited to see what happens with him in the draft, in 2023. But Garrett Wilson, for all intents and purposes, did pass Chris Olave. Just because Olave was the first one on the scene, it seems like we knew his name years ago. Doesn't necessarily translate one-to-one, and it was really good to see Garrett Wilson emerge. That Purdue game, I watched the Purdue game. That's when he went 10 for 126 and 3 touchdowns. Also had a 51-yard touchdown run. So this is a guy you talk to, the yak ability isn't the same as some of these other guys, but he has that big play potential. I'm excited to see him run. I want to see how that 40 time shakes out. Again, 40s aren't the end-all be-all, but it is a pretty good general gauge of speed. So assuming Garrett Wilson does go ahead and run the 40 this weekend at the Combine, it's going to be interesting to see where he ends up. And I think those Calvin Ridley, Stephon Diggs comps are absolutely perfect for Garrett Wilson. But let's go ahead and talk about another guy who I'd say the opposite mold of a Garrett Wilson. We're going to talk about Drake London. Drake London is your classic big body. I am going to jump over you and catch the ball wide receiver. You think about, I'll go ahead and get into a comp, a Mike Evans type guy, 6'5", 210 for Drake London. There's a lot of things to like about his game, but of course there are a lot of red flags. A lot of times we see these big receivers and they are very one-dimensional. We think about the hits at that position like a Mike Evans. We also think about the misses, guys like a Kelvin Benjamin, some of these big body guys that can't take care of themselves. But with Drake London, I'm excited because he's 20 years old, first of all, which is fantastic. He broke out as a freshman at age 18 while playing with Michael Pittman and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So he's still got it done with those two guys on the roster. In his freshman season at USC, 39 receptions, 567 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And if we look at this past season, in only 8 games, he put up these video game numbers, 88 receptions, 1,084 yards, and 7 touchdowns. That's a 25% target share as well. So if we break this down to a per game average for Drake London this past season, that's 11 receptions, 135 yards, and a touchdown per game on average, which is absolutely ridiculous. He did suffer a season-ending ankle fracture. So we're likely not going to see any testing from this guy at the combine. And that's one of the biggest red flags with him for now, just kind of that unknown. But Steph, we see it year in and year out, and I'm sure you may comment on this, but like last year, Jalen Waddle, very different player, but he's one of those guys you said, we're not seeing him test, and that could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. It just creates more risk around this player because we don't have the full profile. We don't know as much about him at this stage in his career. So that's the one thing you have to consider. But at the same time, that could make him end up being a draft day discount. That could end up making him be a discount in your dynasty league. But I think Drake London, for me, is firmly in the top 3 wide receivers in this class. He should go in the first round of the NFL draft. He has good enough speed to get it done at the NFL level, but definitely not elite speed. And again, going back to that Mike Evans comp, I think that is the upside for Drake London. He's the red zone threat. He has the ability to win the jump balls, and he can still make those big plays downfield as well. So this is a guy that's going to win with his size, not as much with his speed. But I love that he's 20 years old. I love the production at USC. And I love what he was able to do with other targets like Michael Pittman and Amon-Ra St. Brown there for his first couple seasons.
Yeah, you got to love what Drake London brings to the table. And as far as the injury goes and his testing, we can let the draft capital sort that out for us, right? These scouts that are getting paid millions and millions and millions of dollars have a full industry, a whole career path that people spend their whole lives perfecting is scouting these players. They also get access to medical reports. They get to interview these players. They get to look at their IQ tests. Like there's all these other things that we could just rely on the draft capital to tell us, does the NFL believe in this player's health, believe in their mentality, believe in their physical ability to get it done? So as long as London does get that high-end draft capital, I'm not worried at all about the lack of testing. That was probably one of the things I missed out on Jalen Waddle in Dynasty because I was so concerned about his lack of production, lack of testing when the NFL told us, right, that he was a top-tier receiver, and we saw him do monster things his freshman year. But let me stick with this Ohio State receiving core. Let me jump over to Chris Olave. We're seeing him right now in mock drafts, NFL drafts, as a late first, early second round pick. And I'm not throwing shade. I'm not saying he's a bad receiver, but I think there is a noticeable drop-off after the big 3. Then you have Olave. And I'm not totally sold on Olave being necessarily a way better prospect than Jameson Williams or a way better prospect than George Pickens. And certainly Olave has those guys beat as far as his career counting stats. And you can't take away the fact that Olave broke out as a 19-year-old sophomore at Ohio State, but he doesn't have anything that screams like exceptional freak world beater on his profile, right? You look at the big 3. Burks has the size. He has the 1,100 yard, 30% target share season. Drake London has the 18-year-old breakout age, the size, the ridiculous stats on a per game basis. Garrett Wilson has this pristine profile, the ideal size, the early declare, would have had over 1,200 receiving yards if he had played that entire junior season. And I don't want to sound like I don't like Olave or that I'm out on him as a top 5 wide receiver name in this class. I think he profiles as a number 2. A number 2 field stretcher plus. My comps for him are like Emmanuel Sanders, prime Emmanuel Sanders, or Tyler Lockett. All right, and it feels like every class at this point, every single year, has that Tyler Lockett comp. That's what Chris Olave is for me. And let's dive into the production story here. We saw Olave get buried just like Garrett Wilson, just like Jameson Williams, as a freshman playing behind Paris Campbell, Terry McLaurin. And then as a sophomore, had a hyper-efficient season. Even though he was out-targeted by KJ Hill by 9 receptions, he put up 200 more yards, had a ridiculous 17.5 yards per reception, 12 touchdowns. And think about this, 12 touchdowns on 48 targets. So he put up a touchdown every 4 catches as a true sophomore in the Big Ten. And he was 19 years old at that time. And then he moved to his junior year, starts to try to fight off Garrett Wilson, but he's creeping up, still putting up huge numbers with Justin Fields. You saw the chemistry with them on the field, leading up to that national championship game. And on a 13 pace as a junior, 93 receptions, over 1,300 yards, 13 touchdowns, phenomenal year from Chris Olave, even with the limited sample size. And then for some reason, he doesn't declare for the draft. And that's something where people say, oh, he didn't declare, he's trash, right? Or I'm out on Chris Olave, because if he was truly that good, he would have declared. But I think a lot of people are overreacting to that extra year, because really where it only matters is from a profile perspective, right? He's still 21 years old. So it's not like, oh, he's a not an early declare, so he's this older, dusty receiver. No, he's actually younger than Treylon Burks. He's the same age as Garrett Wilson. And what we've seen time and time again, whether it was Kadarius Toney, Devonta Smith, if he gets the draft capital and flashes as a rookie, everyone's going to forget about the fact that he was a 4-year player in college. But certainly I think it hurt his stock, because in that senior year, you would expect for a guy who's going to be this first or second round name in the NFL to show out, since he didn't declare early. And he got pretty significantly outproduced by Garrett Wilson, by Jackson Smith-Njigba. Now, both of those guys look to be NFL caliber stars, so I don't want to overreact to that either. But as a senior, Olave dropped from 100 yards a game down to 85. He did post a team and career high 13 touchdowns, still saw a very decent 21% target share. So all things considered, it was a good season. Again, just not world-beating, exceptional, generational. And at 6'1", 188 pounds, Olave has that Slim Reaper type build. You know, some of the comps I mentioned were like the Tyler Lockett. Like, he can be a very good number 2 for a team. Maybe he can develop into a number 1 as he develops, as he builds out his route tree, as he works on the footwork. But we never saw that true alpha season from Olave that we saw with some of these other receivers. It's not a death sentence, okay? Jalen Waddle never had a true breakout year. Terry McLaurin, also out of Ohio State, 4-year player, never had a true breakout year. So Olave has had an impressive college career. He's going to be a highly combine and draft capital dependent player for me when it comes to these dynasty rookie drafts. We could see him blaze a 4.3 and get first-round draft capital, and then I'm going to be in. We could potentially see him run 4.5, go mid-day 2. So I'm going to let the NFL tell me what they think about Olave, but certainly a guy that we should not be leaving behind just because he came back for that 4th year.
Yeah, I agree. With Olave, it was weird last year. I feel like if he would have declared, he had a better shot at being a first-round pick last year than he does this year, which is strange because last year's class was so good. But coming off the season he had as an early declare, it felt like Olave was one of those top guys right in the conversation. You know, I don't want to say Jamar Chase, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle after the seasons they had, but we saw how crazy high those guys went. So Kadarius Toney goes mid-first round. Like, he could have been right in the conversation as a first-round pick, and that would have silenced all hate on Chris Olave. And we saw him have a good, not great season like you talked about. So we'll see where the draft capital shakes out. Wouldn't be surprised at all to see him go in round 1. But Steph, let's transfer from Ohio State over to Alabama, just like Jameson Williams did while he was in college. I've been thinking about that one for a while. But Jameson Williams is the next guy we're going to break down. This guy was at Ohio State for a couple of years. Steph already alluded to some of the names he was buried behind, along with the Garrett Wilsons of the world. And he goes over to Alabama and has an absolutely bananas season in 2021. He's 6'2", 189. So we're thinking that lighter build, close to that Stephon Diggs mold that you talked about earlier when you broke down Garrett Wilson, a little bit taller. He's 21 years old. So he's not one of these crazy old 24-year-old guys because he transferred. No, he still is fairly young as well. And last season he had 79 receptions, 1,572 yards, and 15 touchdowns. So this guy's a big play waiting to happen. And interestingly enough, I didn't realize this, Steph, and I know production isn't everything, but it took him a while to get going at Alabama this season. We look at his first couple games. I mean, he had a big week in their opener against Miami, 4 for 126 and a touchdown. But then we saw him go 3 for 31, 4 for 61, 1 for 81. The receptions weren't there. The targets weren't there, but the production was with these crazy big plays. And then as they got into SEC play, he just had some monster games against A&M, 10 for 146 and 2, 10 for 160 and 1 against LSU, 6 for 158 and 3 in like a half against New Mexico State, and then another 8 for 190 and 3 against Arkansas. Not to mention SEC championship, 7 for 184 and 2. So Jameson Williams, I mean, this guy was the guy. And I know John Mechie was healthy for a good part of the year, unfortunately tore his ACL towards the end of the year. So Jameson Williams moved into that clear target funnel situation. But Jameson Williams can get it done at all three levels. And he's that speed threat, but he's also tremendous after the catch. So I think about last year, one of the guys that I thought was so smooth and silky almost, if you will, with his routes was Elijah Moore. And he is more of a slot guy. Jameson Williams brings that natural vibe and that natural slipperiness on the field to the outside, but he can also just absolutely burn you deep, and he has the height to win those jump balls. So we love Jameson Williams. We love the production profile. Obviously, the elephant in the room is the fact that he tore his ACL in the national championship game, but he should still get that first-round draft capital, Steph. I think if Jameson Williams doesn't tear his ACL, he is firmly in that top three for me, with Garrett Wilson, with Drake London, with Treylon Burks. And honestly, even with him tearing that ACL, my first tier actually probably would include Jameson Williams at this point as well. So we don't know if he'll be ready for the season. I'd be surprised if he was ready for week one off that ACL, but we see guys tear their ACL and come back to full strength all the time. It's not one of those death sentence injuries. But with Jameson Williams, I do expect him to get that first-round draft capital, and that's something we're talking about with these prospects. We can look at them all day, but these NFL teams put their money where their mouth is. They have scouting departments that are looking at these guys every move, and I expect him to get that capital, which would say a lot about where I'm taking him in these dynasty startup drafts. Right now, I do think he has the ability to be a team's number one receiver. You talked about with Olave. His upside, if you will, is almost like to be a really good number two. Where with Jameson Williams, I think he does have the ability to emerge as that true number one. I think he could start his year as a number two, especially coming off of that injury. You know, I'd like to see him go to a team with an established number one guy that needs that second option. Or who knows, he could end up in a place like Atlanta if they move on from Calvin Ridley, and we could see him be forced into that, you know, number one role right away. And I think he'd find a way to thrive. So I love Jameson Williams. Right now, he would be my... Oh, it's tough. I think, you know, if I'm going off the cuff here, Treylon would be number one for me. I'd probably have Garrett Wilson at 2 and Jameson Williams at 3. I think I might put him in front of Drake London, which I know is a bit of a hot take, but obviously the combine this weekend will tell us about some of the other guys. Obviously not Jameson Williams because he's recovering from that injury. But then as we get through the draft process, we'll learn more and more. But I'm in on Jameson Williams, and if there is that injury discount, he's falling to the late first, 109, 110. I'm going to be having a lot of him on my dynasty rosters.
He is the reason why, especially early this year in rookie drafts, I'm not going Treylon Burks, especially in super flex. Give me a Breece Hall, give me a Malik Willis, depending on landing spot and seeing how things shake out. But like, why not just wait 6 picks and get Jameson Williams or get a George Pickens, who I'll dive into here in a minute. I want to throw out just a take and see what your thoughts are, Alex. See if this is too aggressive, but we see Nick Saban has a type of receiver, right? A Henry Ruggs, an outside speedster that's a little bit thinner. We see that with Jalen Waddle. We even saw that with Devonta Smith. Does Jameson Williams fit in that mold? To me, he seems like a mixture of like a little bit lesser Jalen Waddle with a little bit of Devonta Smith's technicality added in. Is that too aggressive of a statement to throw out there?
I don't think it's too aggressive. I mean, anytime we talk about these comps, it's like you're not getting the best of every single world. So he's not like Jalen Waddle speed with Devonta Smith's route running with Jerry, you know, with, you know, better size. Like he's not this like perfect receiver, but in terms of just a comp with how he plays, I guess I could see it. He doesn't really fit either mold for me. He is a little bit different from the Alabama receivers we've seen come out in the past. Yeah, because he's not just strictly a Henry Ruggs. He's not just strictly, he's like it's tough because he's not Jerry Jeudy either, because Jerry Jeudy is this route running technician, but he doesn't quite have the top end speed. Or I would say Jameson Williams' route running isn't quite there, but his speed is better, at least on the field. So he is this different blend. He's very different than the Alabama guys we've seen come out in the past couple of seasons. So with that being said, you're not just going to be able to helmet scout this guy and say, oh, it's another Alabama wide receiver. He almost reminds me of more of that Calvin Ridley type guy. Probably with a little bit more speed, though, again, like we just said. So he is a very unique player. And again, with that skill set, I do think he has the ability to be a number one, because he's not just that burner. He's not just that Henry Ruggs. He's not just that John Ross. You know, we see these speedsters come out, and more times than not, they crash and burn. Even the Mecole Hardman. Some of them might carve out a nice role for a while, but they don't emerge to what we want to see them do. Tyreek Hill is probably the one exception we have in recent memory. But I think he is more than that, which is why I'm optimistic about his outlook.
100%. And it's crazy to see that even if you look back to that freshman year at Ohio State, those first 2 years at Ohio State as an 18 and 19-year-old, he was still over 17 yards per reception on horrible volume, like sub 10% target share, had 9 receptions as a sophomore, was still hyper efficient all the way through, and then just took that efficiency to the next level when he had 79 receptions on 118 targets that junior year in Alabama. So Jameson Williams is a guy that I don't think is necessarily getting all of the hype right now, a guy that I really like in Dynasty. Now, we're talking about some of these guys, right? Drake London, Jameson Williams. They have injuries that add a little bit of risk, could cause them to fall in the NFL draft, but wait to the draft capital to tell us how confident the NFL is with their health. But another guy from that mold, as far as his injury history, is George Pickens out of Georgia. And he was a guy that I saw as the wide receiver 1 in Devy rankings going into this 2021 college football season. His counting stats aren't great. Just that's the one blemish, right? His counting stats, if you look at his whole career, are not good. He appeared in only 4 games during his junior season after he tore his ACL in spring practice. But we saw him, again, as a junior, because he is an early declare. He made plays during the SEC National Championship game. He showed that he could get healthy enough to be back on the field against Alabama on the biggest stage. You know, even though I don't think he was 100% in those games, if you go back and watch him, he was still out there, and I would expect him to be close to 100% by the start of his rookie NFL season. This is a 6'3", 200-pound wide receiver. Broke out super young, 18-and-a-half-year-old freshman in the SEC, had a 96th percentile breakout age that year with a 15% target share, 727 yards, 8 touchdowns, and then in 2020, in 8 games, he was on pace for 832 yards, 59 receptions, 10 touchdowns, 18% target share with a brutal offense that was 7th in the SEC in pass yards per game. We saw the turmoil between JT Daniels, Stetson Bennett, and that's another issue with even the running backs coming out of Georgia because they have such stud recruits. None of these guys ever going to have a super high dominator rating. They're never going to carry the offense because they spread the ball out so much. But what we did see from George Pickens is an 85th percentile yards per reception. And I actually went back and watched every target from 2020 from George Pickens. And here's some of my notes. He's a lanky receiver. He has a strong catch radius, great speed in the open field. He's a tall, physical receiver. To me, he profiles as that prototype athletic X. Not to do too much helmet scouting, but to me, he does fit that AJ Green mold, maybe even more of like a DJ Chark mold. My actual comp for George Pickens, and I mean this in a good way, is Devontae Parker. As just this tall red zone threat, but if you get him on the open field, he can burn you, he can make plays, and with his size, he's able to pummel these tiny corners. What you're looking for Pickens at the next level is for him to grow his route tree, refine his route running, but based on his film, what I've heard from other film grinders is that Pickens has all the tools, and we'll just wait for the draft capital to tell us about his health.
I love the Devontae Parker comp. I mean, it's tough. He's one of those guys that sky's the limit, but we only know what we know, and we didn't get to see a ton from him. So I think a team's going to take a gamble on him because of the physical tools you talked about, and we'll see if it pays off. We've seen first-round receivers flake out time and time again. Corey Davis looked like a bust for a while. I mean, even Devontae Parker looked like a bust for a while for where they drafted him in the first round. And then we've had the Kevin Whites of the world. And so it's not a lock. It's not a lock. Yeah, N'Keal Harry more recently, but it's definitely not a Jalen Reagor. Yikes. It's not a lock if you're a first round pick that you're going to be good. And I think someone could fall in love with the idea of what Pickens could be. And we'll see how that translates on an NFL field. But I do think with Pickens, there's more risk involved than some of the other guys we're talking about, both in your dynasty leagues and in the NFL draft. Again, because we just don't have as much information. But Steph, I want to talk about another SEC guy. And I know I have a couple guys on my list. I'm going out of order here a little bit because this is someone I just want to talk about, not because of the school he went to, because we're both Louisville Cardinal guys, but Wan'Dale Robinson from Kentucky. I am so excited about his outlook in the NFL that I'm going to say it right now. He is a guy that's going to end up on almost all my rosters, and I'm going to reach on him. I am in on Robinson, 5'10", 185. He's 21 years old. He broke out at age 18 there's the thing about Robinson, there's nothing not to like about his profile. 5'10", 185, the size, maybe you wish he was a little bit bigger, but 21 years old, broke out at age 18 at Nebraska, transfers over to Kentucky, and absolutely takes his game to the next level. At Kentucky, he had 104 receptions, 1,334 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Almost had a 40% target share at Kentucky. So this guy was getting absolutely funneled the ball in this offense, and he's my sleeper in this class. I hope he actually doesn't get that much hype leading up to the draft, because I want to get all the shares of him, because I watched him a lot as well, and I just believe in the talent and the production that he had at UK. We'll see how the combine goes. We'll see how that draft capital shakes out, but I'm definitely going to be targeting him everywhere. He has phenomenal speed, but he's also an incredible route runner. And I know that's a dangerous thing to put together, because you start to talk about these receivers that are like unstoppable, but his player comp for me is a Brandon Cooks. You know, size-wise, he's identical. He likely doesn't have the 4.3 speed that Cooks has, but his route running is probably better. You know, when Cooks was coming out of college, he was more of that burner guy. I think at this stage of his career, Wan'Dale Robinson's route running is better than Brandon Cooks was coming out of college. So if Robinson can be in that low 4.4 range, I think what he can do with his route running, more of that Keenan Allen type technician, could be absolutely lethal. So if you think about a guy who could be Keenan Allen with more speed, you start to see the upside. Now, obviously, that's the upside projection of what he could be, but I think he's going to be an absolute problem in the NFL, and he's going to make an impact right away. So I'm excited about this guy. Obviously not a big UK fan, but he had the production on the field. He had the early breakout age. He has the speed. He has the route running ability. There's nothing not to like about his profile. So for me, as long as he at least gets that day 2 draft capital and he tests solid at the combine, which I fully expect, and he doesn't absolutely bomb out, this is someone that's going to be one of those mid-second round picks that I'm going to make sure I'm scooping up everywhere I can.
What's so impressive on top of that, 40% target share as a junior in the SEC. I mean, just say that again out loud. It's ridiculous. Also had a 75th percentile dominator rating, was responsible for 37% of the receiving yards and touchdowns. Again, in the SEC, playing against the hardest competition, literally was I'm not going to say carrying, but doing a lot of the moving of the sticks for an SEC offense, which you love to see. My only question for Wan'Dale Robinson is, can he be an Alpha X, or does he profile as more of a, bursty slot receiver? Alex, what are your thoughts on that? Since you've dived into his tape a little bit more.
Yeah, it's tough, because I think when Brandon Cooks, I mean, that's the comp, that's the size comp. When Brandon Cooks was coming out, with his size and with him really being that speed guy in the low 4.3s, I think most people probably profiled him as a field stretcher, and they wondered, could he craft the rest of his game around that to be a number one? And now we've seen Cooks be a number one on several different teams in the NFL, go with over 1,000 yards with several different teams. So to me, I do think that's the upside for Robinson, is that Brandon Cooks level player. Again, I threw Keenan Allen's name out there as well, but I think he definitely doesn't comp to Keenan Allen. But I think from a route running perspective, if he gets his route running developed as he gets into the NFL, he could be that kind of guy with more speed. So I think the possibility's there. We see smaller receivers turn into number ones. I mean, look at Cooper Kupp, look at Antonio Brown during his prime. Like, it's not all we think of these DK Metcalf, AJ Brown sized guys that are just absolute beasts on the field as these big time number ones, but it's not always that way. More often than not, I'd argue we actually see smaller guys really putting up the incredible numbers, the 150 target seasons that are turning to 100 for 100 receptions, 1,300 yards, and 7 or 8 touchdowns. So I think he could turn into a number one. I'm not going to count on it. I think at the least he is going to be that strong number two. I mean, if this guy went to a place like a Kansas City, that would be phenomenal to pair him with Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. That's like the landing spot you want every single player to go to, though, right? Like, maybe he does end up on the LA Chargers with Keenan Allen on the other side. I'd love to see him learn from him. Or maybe he goes somewhere and he's not, the number two right away. Maybe he goes to a Minnesota and then he's the guy that's going to take over for an Adam Thielen. So there's tons of different options for Wan'Dale Robinson. And I think he has the upside to be the number one, but a lot of that could depend on landing spot, and it could depend on his development in his first couple seasons in the NFL.
One thing I'd love to see from Wan'Dale Robinson is for him to just get on the field early, right?
Yes.
Get there on special teams. He had 230 special teams yard as a true freshman at 19 years old at Nebraska. this could be a guy that we see just get on the field to start his career and have that later breakout, maybe even a year 2 breakout. But a guy that's really exciting. We're going to have to follow along throughout this entire process. And the fact that he's not going to be a guy who goes in, early round 1 or even early round 2 means that he could hit a fantastic landing spot. That's what you kind of like with some of the receivers we're getting into now is they're not these top 20 names where the bad teams are going to scoop them up. Some of these deeper prospects could be taken by the good teams where you have a guy hit a smash landing spot. But a guy that I really like, that I think does actually, well, we'll get into how he could profile into a team, but it's David Bell out of Purdue. Even if you don't think he's elite in anything, I think you have to love David Bell because the production is there. He's one of those guys that if you look at his production, it's fantastic every single step of the way. He's an early declare, 6'2", 205 pounds. So fits that ideal prototype mold. He's not a super big body guy, but also not an undersized speedster. He's kind of that middle ground like a Justin Jefferson. But he broke out as a true freshman before he even turned 19, a 94th percentile breakout age. We had seen the season before, Wan'Dale Moore had that breakout, with that 96th percentile breakout age. It's like David Bell had a comparable season to Wan'Dale Moore's freshman year. And Wan'Dale Moore got all this hype. Wan'Dale Moore got round 2 draft capital. David Bell's not quite getting the same amount of hype, but I don't see why, because he stepped right into that wide receiver 1 role as a true freshman when Wan'Dale Moore only played 4 games as a sophomore. And he was going toe-to-toe with Wan'Dale Moore as far as yardage per game, had over 1,000 receiving yards, very impressive 25% target share, 7 touchdowns. And then he only improved on that for 2 years. And one of the things that was really cool to see, and I'd be interested to see if any analytics guys are watching this, anybody who has access to all the numbers, did we see wide receivers get inflated during that COVID year? Because I did feel like almost every single prospect I looked at had a monster per game stats from that 5-game, 6-game, 7-game, 8-game sample size in the 2020 season. That's not to take anything away from David Bell, but he absolutely went nuclear, pretty much carried the passing game. Had more than double the yards of the number 2 receiving option in Purdue, 28% target share, 8.5 receptions per game, over 100 yards per game, on pace for over 1,200 yards. Also had 8 touchdowns in 6 games on an offense that had 15 total passing touchdowns. So literally more than half of the receiving touchdowns went through David Bell. And then in his junior season, he just maintained great production over a full season sample size. So that's one of those things where it's like, limited sample size. We're not going to put too much stock in that nuclear season from David Bell. Well, guess what? Shows up again his junior season, repeats. And, he's just a hair below 1,300 yards, 23% target share, wide receiver 1 numbers. I think his college profile is safe. I don't think there's any holes in his counting stats. 69th percentile dominator. So he's responsible for 35% of Purdue's receiving yards and receiving touchdowns. He's not the biggest yak monster in the world. He's not going to be pummeling guys over. He doesn't necessarily look to have the fastest game speed in the world from what I saw on film, but he is a very solid route runner, great at making receptions in traffic, seems to be a great blocker, which could earn him some additional draft capital. My comp, depending on his combine metrics, are either Tyler Boyd or Adam Thielen, right? Not true speedsters, but reliable receivers that can be used all over the field, X, Y, and Z. I think Bell's a little bit more landing spot dependent than some of these other prospects. I think you want to see him go to a pass-heavy offense because he doesn't quite profile as the true number 1 receiver. Not to say he can't develop into that, but he can be a great number 2, just like we've seen from Tyler Boyd, just like Adam Thielen, as just these studs from the slot, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I like it. And you said it best. I mean, Bell, I don't want to say he doesn't do anything great, but he is just the word I would use to describe him is he's just steady. He's just a solid player all around. There really are no holes in his game.
He's Mario. He's Mario. When you're at the character select screen, you look at everybody's stars. Mario's just 3 stars across the board, and that's David Bell.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of intriguing landing spots for him, and I agree with you. I mean, talking about him being just a solid number 2, and if he goes to the right offense, that's a pass-heavy offense, he could have a ton of production as a number 2. There are a couple teams that come to mind that I think could go for Bell. Not to say that I think they would all be great landing spots, but I think about somewhere like the Chicago Bears. Pair him with a Darnell Mooney. Not saying I would love that landing spot, but I even think about your Cleveland Browns, Stef. If they pass on Burks, maybe they come back to Bell in the second round if he's available. And then there's always the Falcons, who, if they move on for Calvin Ridley, even if they don't, they could use another wide receiver in that offense. So those are, I think, some of the premier landing spots for the wide receivers in this year's class. Obviously, the Chiefs are always going to be thrown out there as well. The Packers could be in play if Rodgers is back, if Adams is back, to need that number 2 guy. And then the New England Patriots, I think, are another interesting one.
I love the Patriots you threw out there. I was going to throw that out there too. And what you said about Cleveland made me think, and I didn't think about this when I was diving into the tape necessarily, but Jarvis Landry could be another comp, just a guy who will find ways to get open, whether it's in traffic, whether it's in the intermediate levels of the field. Love that you threw that out there.
Steph, let's go ahead and move on to next guy on my list. This guy, I'm going to go ahead and talk about Justyn Ross from Clemson next. And this dude is as confusing as it gets as a prospect. I mean, I knew his story, but digging into it a little bit more, I'm like, what the heck is going on? Because I do remember, I mean, first let me get into the numbers, his measurables, his age, things like that. He's 6'4", 205. So he's that big body, tall, go-get-it receiver. I'll talk about it more later. The easy comp is Mike Williams for me. Mike Williams also went to Clemson, but they're almost identical size and they have the same style and the same traits. He's 22 years old, and I think he has the widest range of outcomes of any wide receiver in this entire class, because I do remember Ross as a freshman at Clemson, and I remember thinking to myself, oh, this is the next, Clemson wide receiver line. They had DeAndre Hopkins, and then they had Mike Williams. T. Higgins is out of Clemson, actually played there at the same time as Ross. And Clemson has this history of producing good wide receivers. And I was like, oh, next in line is Justyn Ross. And in that freshman season at age 18, he broke out and he posted 46 receptions for 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns. That was with Trevor Lawrence at quarterback. And he posted, as a freshman, a 1,000-yard season with T. Higgins, Amari Rodgers, Hunter Renfrow, all on this team. So he emerged as the number 1 guy as a freshman with all these other NFL talents on the team, and then was still solid as a sophomore, but the production did level off a bit. We saw T. Higgins really take over and be the clear number 1. He was the 1A. Ross was more of the 2B. So that was kind of like a red flag. We said, okay, let's see what happens next season. In his junior season, he missed the entire year with a neck injury. So you don't love to see that. And then the production was at its lowest this past season, but the quarterback play was rough at Clemson, and the offense struggled as a whole. So it's like, how much of it can we attribute to that? And then he also played through a foot injury that actually caused him to get shut down at the end of the year. So we see him break out as a freshman with other NFL talent on the team. Then he takes a backseat and is still okay, misses a full season due to injury. And then there's just a rough offense, and he's also fighting an injury, and his production is bad. So the question becomes, were Ross's struggles last season due to the injury? Were they due to the bad offense, or were they due to something else? And I'm so excited to see him test at the combine, because his speed and explosiveness on the field definitely looked challenged versus where it was early in his Clemson career. So now if he's fully recovered, I want to know, was that because he was playing through this nagging foot injury, or is he back and is his speed where it needs to be successful in the NFL? So when we talk about Ross as a prospect, there's a lot to uncover, a lot to break down, but he does have great size. He has that contested catch ability. He could be an elite downfield threat, a red zone threat in an NFL offense. I see him being a strong number 2 on an NFL team. I threw out the Mike Williams comp. I think that's perfect for him. And we saw this past season when Mike Williams was healthy, just what he can do on a game-by-game basis. We finally saw him really start to break out. He's had a double-digit touchdown season. He's had an 1,000-yard season in the NFL. So I think if Ross hits that outcome and is a strong number 2 and a red zone threat for an offense, that could be fantastic. So I'm interested to see Ross test at the combine. I would be surprised, or I wouldn't be surprised if he went early on day 2. I also wouldn't be surprised to see him end up falling to day 3, and we'll get a little bit more insight and information on that, and we'll get a better understanding on where he could be drafted after we see the combine and some of the pre-draft testing. But Ross is a curious prospect, and if he ends up going on day 2, if he makes it into round 3, and the landing spot is decent, and even if he starts out as the number 3, I might be willing to take him with a late second, early third round pick just to see if that upside is going to be there, and if you can throw out the last 2 seasons because of injury, and if we're going to get that freshman sophomore year Justyn Ross and see him develop into a good NFL player.
And we'll continue to update our ranks, posting our rookie Superflex ADPs, where we would take guys, different tier breaks. All of that will be in our Discord channel. Link to that in the description down below. It's free to join. Alex and I are in there all the time chopping it up. This is the perfect time of the year to have direct access to us because all the redraft guys are gone. It is quiet on the redraft front right now. It is all Dynasty rookie season. These are the real fantasy gamers, the real football fans that are still in tune. But Justyn Ross is one of those names that you just love to take a dart throw on, right? Back of the second. That's his ADP right now. I think it's a fine ADP for him because we don't know where he's going to end up. But at that point in your rookie drafts, nothing is a sure thing. Might as well take the upside shot on a guy that is this 6'4", go up and get it type receiver. Now let me talk about Skyy Moore. Skyy Moore, he's that analytical darling. He's the guy that, like a Brian Edwards, that everyone's going to be all over on Twitter. All these numbers guys are going to just be all over Skyy Moore. I'm already seeing him top 10, top 8 in some of these rankings that people are putting out. And I think it's for good reason. Skyy Moore is an early declare out of Western Michigan. Shout out to the Broncos. And as a 19-year-old freshman, he led the team in receiving yards with 800, commanded a 21% target share, a super efficient 15.7 yards per reception. So very good freshman season, even though it wasn't against the best competition they are in the MAC conference. Then he had a true breakout season, meaning that he was responsible for more than 20% of the team's receiving yards and touchdowns. That's what we consider a breakout per playerprofiler.com. He has the 62nd percentile breakout age. It's fine, 20 years old. But in 5 games in the COVID year, he saw a 24% target share, was on pace to have over 1,000 yards in a 13-game season. His catch rate jumped up from 59% as a freshman to 67% as a sophomore. It was a small sample. And this is the thing for me that caused me hesitation. Why was Skyy Moore outproduced in a big way by Dwayne Eskridge as a sophomore? If you remember last year, Dwayne Eskridge, also out of Western Michigan, was drafted in the second round by the Seattle Seahawks. He missed 8 games after a concussion in week 1, then never really did anything. 32% snap share outside of the top 140 wide receivers. It's probably on a lot of dynasty waiver wires, still on taxi squads. I know it's helmet scouting, but I do see some similarities from the fact that both of these guys dominated the MAC conference. They both played cornerback at some point in their college careers. Both guys are 5'9". Both guys had 90th percentile dominator in their final season in college, meaning they were responsible for 44% of their team's passing game. Both these guys are rumored to be these explosive weapons. If you remember, Eskridge ran a 4.45. I'm seeing rumors right now. If you just type in Skyy Moore 40 on Google, you will see articles saying that he's going to run a 4.39, which I'll believe it when I see it. Okay. But the thing is, in that junior season, Skyy Moore did quiet some of the sample size haters when he went nuclear as a junior. 11 targets per game, a ridiculous 37% target share, a 70% catch rate on 135 targets, just under 1,300 yards, 10 touchdowns. So Skyy Moore is this big producer. Okay, there's going to be questions about his draft capital. I'm seeing projected early day 3 right now, which I think is a good spot for a team to invest in him. The concern is that if you're going to be under 5'11" in the NFL, you either have to have elite long speed or vertical threat, or you have to be this technician, this separator like a Deontay Johnson, Justin Jefferson, Stephon Diggs. And after studying Skyy Moore's tape, I'm not necessarily seeing either of those things pop out in his film. His go-to is slants from the slot. You don't see him beating guys deep. You don't see him shedding a bunch of tackles with the ball in his hands. You don't see him beating guys off the line of scrimmage with his release. And straight up, if Skyy Moore runs slower than a 4.55, I'm out. This is a guy I'm not even going to have on my radar anymore because just you add all these things in, the weak level of competition, the struggles early, even though they were impressive numbers in context. If he runs a low 4.4 or God forbid that 4.39, I think he then becomes a really fun prospect. A good dart throw in the late second, early third, just like Dwayne Eskridge was last year. My comp for Skyy Moore, and it was kind of hard because he is this undersized playmaker at 5'9". So it was hard for me to find a great comp, but he's a poor man's Amon-Ra St. Brown in terms of his play style. He's really strong at the catch point. He's great at catching the ball in traffic. The body control is very impressive. Probably going to play slot in the NFL. I don't see that as a death sentence per se, but that definitely caps his ceiling. I would prefer to take the shot on a Justyn Ross that he might hit his peak level upside. I'd prefer Wan'Dale Robinson, Jahan Dotson, unless he gets significantly better draft capital. I'm even take a shot on Christian Watson, who we'll talk about here in a minute, over Skyy Moore, but could be a fun prospect depending on how this combine goes for him.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think if Moore can get that late second round, early third round draft capital, he's someone I'm going to be willing to take a flyer on and, early third in some of these super flex drafts. But Steph, you mentioned Dotson, Jahan Dotson from Penn State as a guy you would still take over Skyy Moore. So let's go ahead and get into him. Jahan Dotson, 5'11", 183. You mentioned with Moore, if you're 5'11 or below, you really have to have elite speed or be an elite separator. And fortunately for Dotson, he has both of those abilities in his game. He is a technical route runner. He's a fluid route runner. He really has that football IQ where he can really read that defensive back and break them down to get open and create that natural separation. Quick shout out to the Draft Network. They actually talk about Jahan Dotson being a former basketball player, and it looks like every time he's running a route, he just wants to cross over the DB and get open, which I thought was an interesting way to describe it. They say his basketball background appears when he wants to cross over defenders with a smooth and crip rocker step. So Dotson's got that ability to get open, and he also ran track in high school, so he is that speedster as well. I wouldn't say either are like NFL 95th percentile and above elite speed or elite route running, but both are very, very good, very above average for these prospects. So I think Dotson certainly does have a chance in the NFL. He's 22 years old, out of Penn State. His season last year was pretty solid, 91 receptions, 1,182 yards, and 12 touchdowns, a 30% target share, the clear number one for this offense. Penn State, though, a team that's defensive minded in a lot of defensive battles, in a lot of games where the over-under is 37.5. So you think about that kind of capping the ceiling for Dotson, but he still was able to rise above and produce on this offense. He has that combo of speed and quickness. And again, not elite with either trait, but very good with both. Deontay Johnson's a name that comes to mind when I'm thinking about Dotson, because Johnson has the speed to get it done. He also has that great separation ability with his route running. So they're also very similar with their size and that athleticism. So I think Dotson could go in round 2. I think he could go mid to early round 2, which makes him very, very interesting for me. He is one of those guys we've talked about with these wide receivers, who's going to be a number 1 in the NFL and who's going to be just a really good number 2. I see Dotson as more of a strong number 2, if I'm being honest. Obviously, Deontay Johnson, his comp, is someone who has emerged to be a number 1 against the odds with his size. But I think Dotson could be a very strong number 2 and can make an impact right away for an NFL team. We talked about a lot of the landing spots we would love to see from guys in this class. And I think if Dotson went to the New England Patriots, for example, pair him with Mac Jones, maybe we do see him emerge as a number 1 for that offense. We could see him go to the New Orleans Saints and play with Michael Thomas. We could see him go to the Minnesota Vikings. I think the Vikings are going to be an interesting team where it's like, hey, they still have Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen for now, but who is going to be that next guy that steps into that number 2 role? I think maybe the Skyy Moores of the world are better fit for that because they might not get on the field as much right away. But Dotson is someone who I think can step onto a team and make an impact right away. He's a guy in his rookie season. I'd love to see him have a Rondale Moore level impact, where he's not a consistent fantasy option necessarily year one, but he has a lot of really good games. But going into year 2, maybe some opportunity clears up with the Cardinals this year. We see Christian Kirk as a free agent, AJ Green, the C's could be parting for Rondale Moore to be that clear number 2 and have a bigger role. So I'd love to see Dotson go into a similar situation where he's on the field, he's making plays, we see him flash, and as he progresses into year 2 and year 3, we see the opportunity increase and see him really start to take off as a prospect.
Yeah, I love Jahan Dotson, and I keep seeing him mocked to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Interesting.
Not a bad landing spot.
We'll see what happens with Godwin.
Mike Evans, and they put Jahan Dotson in the slot. Could be exciting. But shout out to our boy Jared Davis in the chat. Says, keep your eye on Christian Watson. Trust me, Jared. We have our eyes on Christian Watson. I do, especially because he's the type of player that I love. The 6'4", 211-pound outside receiver. You didn't see him play in the slot at all in college. Those are the guys I like. That's why I was so in love with T. Higgins. I always throw out like the DJ Chark, Devontae Parker, AJ Green type guys. Those are those athletic, big body guys that I just always find myself falling in love with. Christian Watson is right now, he's the Senior Bowl darling, right? He wasn't really like on anyone's radar in a huge way. And then he goes to the Senior Bowl, shows out, was making plays all over the field, was impressing scouts as a blocker. Now he's coming out of North Dakota State. That's an FCS school. So lack of competition is always going to be a concern when we're talking about his profile. He's a 4-year player. Played his first 3 years with Trey Lance as his quarterback, and he's going to be 23 at the start of the NFL season. He broke out at 20.3 years old. It's a 53 percentile dominator, just above that 50 threshold. So he just slipped in there as far as his breakout age. Really didn't do anything as a freshman. 9 receptions, but posted over 18 yards per reception, what you like to see. Then had some good production as a sophomore, 732 yards. But it was in 16 games because North Dakota State just ran through everybody on the way to another FCS title. 46 yards a game that season. Not great. But then he built on that with 54 yards per game in 8 games in 2020, then 67 yards a game as a 22-year-old senior when he posted a 90th percentile dominator. So he did carry the North Dakota State offense. It was responsible for 44% of the team's receiving yards and touchdowns. And his efficiency is insane. Like, he's one of those guys, like, he's not a target magnet. He's not a volume hog, but 20.5 yards per reception across his entire college career. That's Jalen Waddle level. That's actually better efficiency from a yards per reception standpoint than Jalen Waddle, who is one of those darlings because of his yards per reception, his efficiency when he had the ball in his hands. He also had over 100 rushing yards each season at North Dakota State, which you'd like to see for a guy who has some questions. Yeah, shout out. You got to love a wide receiver that's 6'5" and returns kicks. Absolutely. Christian Watson is reported to have 4.4 speed, 4.4 high speed. So you love to see that. The comp for me, this is just from a play style perspective. And this is a deep name. I had to dig into my notepad a little bit here. Martavis Bryant, a tall, explosive receiver that can make plays all over the field, on special teams, on jet sweeps. We saw Martavis Bryant. He went to Clemson. The level of competition is still a concern, but I can see a team with a desperate need at X taking a shot on Christian Watson because of what he's doing in the Senior Bowl. They like the size and the speed in the NFL. Like, we saw undrafted Adam Thielen get picked up by a team just because he ran a 4.4. And so could see some of that with Christian Watson here. The combine will be extremely important, obviously, for him from a guy with his draft stock coming in. But I like his upside, 3rd round, depending on draft capital, maybe late 2nd round of these rookie drafts, to be an outside playmaker. I don't see the target magnet upside, but could be a big play, boom bust type name. That's what I see as his best fantasy outcome. So he's a fun prospect, a guy that I'm just drawn to because of his size and speed.
Yeah, I love it. And we often see these small school guys not get the draft capital that we necessarily want to see. But with a guy like Watson and the profile he has, we see it just so many wide receivers go on day 2, round 2, round 3. They're always filled with receivers. I would love to see Watson go in the 3rd round of the NFL draft. Even if he goes in the 4th round, I'll still have some interest, just as that deep 3rd round in your super flex leagues name that you might be able to pick up and see if he can hit. So Watson, I mean, he's that small school guy to keep an eye on. We'll see how the draft process goes for him, because obviously going to North Dakota State, not a school that we watch very often, not a guy we're keeping up with necessarily throughout the year. So this pre-draft process really helps us get to know players like Watson. And you said it, the Senior Bowl was what essentially put him really on the radar and started to cause Watson to have his rise. We'll see if he continues to ascend as we get closer to the NFL draft. But Stef, we're almost out of time here. There are some other names in this class that I just want to mention. We're not going to break them down, but I just want to throw the names out there because as we get through the combine this weekend, these are names that could be risers and fallers. Again, follow along in the Discord if you want to ask questions about these guys. If you want to just get Steph and I's takes on these guys, we're always going to be answering questions in the Discord. We're going to start to post our rankings for this rookie class in there as well and keep those updated for you guys. And if these guys start to hit, if these guys start to become hot commodities, these deep names will get into future videos. We're going to be talking about these rookies for the next couple months. It's going to be a ton of fun with some of this Dynasty content. So some names in this class: Jalen Tolbert, Calvin Austin, Slade Bolden, Alec Pierce, John Mechie as well. Steph, any other names I'm forgetting here as we move towards the combine this weekend and into some of this rookie content?
Oh, man, I think we hit on everybody. I think there is a pretty steep drop-off after Christian Watson. Like some of the names you threw out there, it's going to take a lot for these guys to break out. We'll try to help you all find those diamonds in the rough for your fantasy rosters, whether it's Dynasty, whether it is redraft. But again, join the Discord, compete against us in Dynasty, join the conversation, join leagues. We appreciate y'all listening and watching. As always, a like and a sub greatly appreciated. And we'll see y'all next time. Peace.
Peace.